InvestorIdeas.com podcast.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of InvestorIdeas.com podcasts. In today's episode, I'm going to be taking a look at a few public company announcements, how the overall price of cannabis is becoming an issue for the industry, as well as how legalization continues to impact cannabis culture. For public company announcements, going to be looking at KHRN Life Sciences Corporation, trading on the TSXV Venture as KHRN and the OTCQX as KHRNF, as well as Village Farms International Incorporated, trading on the NASDAQ as VFF. So first today, starting with KHRN Life Sciences Corporation, who announced that the new Colombian government has included plant-based medical cannabis products, i.e. KHRN products, in the list of mandatory insurance-covered medications starting January 1st of this year, as well as the signing of the first-of-its-kind medical cannabis contract with one of Colombia's largest insurance companies based in the city of Bogota. Now, Resolution 2808 of 2022 was signed by the Ministry of Health on December 30th of last year, and this revision was necessary to remove unintended ambiguities that had arisen whether plant-based magistral preparations from medical cannabis, i.e. KHRN products, were also included in the insurance coverage, and this is now once and for all clearly confirmed, and the new government is fully committed with the use of medical cannabis as a covered treatment under the Colombian health system. The government used this iteration to also validate medical conditions where they find moderate to strong evidence that cannabis is an effective treatment, and these conditions evaluated by the IETS, the Technical Institute of Health sector, included chronic and neuropathic pain, oncology pain, sleep disorders, epilepsy, and fibromyalgia, which represent the primary conditions treated with KHRN products. And during the first half of 2022, insurance-covered prescriptions represented more than 90% of the company's cannabis sales in Colombia. With a patient base of more than 25,000 patients, KHRN will immediately resume filing insurance-covered prescriptions through its Zerenia Clinic network. Now, in addition, Zerenia Colombia, KHRN's wholly owned medical cannabis clinic network, has entered into a contract to provide integrative health services and pharmacotherapeutic treatment of medical cannabis with the largest government-owned insurance company in the city of Bogota, with more than 1.2 million insured individuals. This is the first time an insurance company in Latin America is contracting medical cannabis-specific services and products, and this represents an opportunity for KHRN and Zerenia to expand its clinic and patient bases within Colombia, while continuing to differentiate itself with an unparalleled expertise in medical cannabis and proprietary scientific evidence. Alvaro Torres, CEO of KHRN, comments, "Today is a great day for patients in Colombia and KHRN. We welcome the decision for the new Colombian government to categorically mandate insurance coverage to our medical cannabis products. With the decision, KHRN will immediately tackle the backlog of covered medical cannabis products to our patients, and in parallel, we also have secured a first-of-its-kind contractual relationship with one of Colombia's largest government-owned insurance companies for medical cannabis-specific healthcare services and dispensation. And these two achievements will allow us to revert to predictable recurring revenues, shorter collection periods, and improved cash flow." So obviously a good thing for KHRN Life Sciences with this being pushed forward, but also just showing, again, sort of the difference between how parts of the world are addressing medical cannabis programs overall, and insurance coverage specifically. As I said a bunch of times, when you're looking at Canada, insurance is still very much lacking when it comes to overall product categories that are being featured, pricing. A lot of these things aren't really actually included in a lot of people's basic medical coverage. Again, obviously in the Canadian system, they're not paying the same type of amount or really at all for their healthcare, but the difference is that you really don't have a lot of products that are available or covered under your sort of medical package. And even most of the extended sort of packages through business don't offer any medical cannabis coverage, at least through insurance. There's very limited amounts in Canada, very, very, very limited amounts in the U.S. And then in Europe, you're starting to see a little bit of that. So in Germany, they've established a little bit more medical coverage with insurance. Again, still very limited. I do think Latin America, specifically Colombia right now, is probably the furthest along when it comes to actually integrating medical cannabis programs into their insurance model and into their whole medical model. They're one of the few countries that seems to be paying attention to this. Obviously, there's other issues going on in Colombia that, you can discuss in your own brain, but I would say, at least as far as paying attention to the medical cannabis program, they've done a little bit better than some of the other counterparts in the world. Again, I've talked a lot about how medical coverage is extremely lacking in a lot of countries, even the ones with well-established cannabis programs. And when you're looking at specific states, recreational tends to often destroy the medical programs. And again, because of the sort of federal scheduling of cannabis within the U.S., insurance coverage is kind of an impossibility. So this is something that needs to start being considered, and when we see examples like this, it's definitely a push in the right direction for the industry. Again, a huge asset for KHRN Life Sciences specifically in this context, but in general, it's just a good example of how things are being pushed forward in Latin America with regards to cannabis legalization, with an understanding that they're actually properly integrating their medical program into their insurance model. And that's kind of what we need to see happen in Canada, in Europe. In Israel, it's actually a little bit more established as well. I forgot to mention that example. But in the U.S., this will be probably one of the biggest hurdles, will be once you do push for any sort of federal rescheduling, which, is being discussed all the time. I don't think it's going to be pushed through for a long time. I do think that you're seeing the slow play right now to make the U.S. into sort of a pharma-based model. And I think that a lot of small steps will happen to sort of guarantee that, as we saw with the federal research. I talked a little bit about that, how that will potentially impact the industry moving forward. But I don't think that you're going to see safe banking or, again, federal rescheduling for quite some time in the U.S. If that does happen, though, that will allow medical programs to gain a little bit more legitimacy, because then you can start including insurance programs as well, like shown here in Colombia. Moving on next to Village Farms International, who announced further progress on its international cannabis strategy and commented that the lack of cannabis legislative action by the U.S. Senate in direct contrast to the 39 states, the District of Columbia with legally sanctioned medical cannabis use and or adult use, while disappointing, does not impact Village Farms' plans to leverage its considerable success in Canada into other cannabis markets with greater regulatory support. So recently, the Canadian company's cannabis business, through its subsidiary Pure Sun Farms, commenced shipping cannabis products to the Israel medical cannabis market under an exclusive 3-year supply agreement with Israeli-based Dr. Samuelov Importing and Marketing Limited, doing business as Better Pharma. So, commencing shipments to Israel is another milestone to our global cannabis strategy, building on a success in Canada and Australia, said Mike DeGiglio, Chief Executive Officer of Village Farms. We're proud and privileged to partner exclusively with Better Pharma for the significant medical cannabis opportunity in Israel, and are confident that Pure Sun Farms' unique everyday premium positioning, which has proven so successful in Canada and Australia, will be differentiated in the Israeli market and well received by patients. So, sales of Pure Sun Farms products to patients in Israel are expected to commence later this month. Initial strains offered will include Pink Kush, Jet Fuel Gelato, and Sakura Punch. And Village Farms continues to execute on its global cannabis strategy, which includes accelerated sales to the Australian medical cannabis market and plans to launch in the German medical market. So, again, as I talked about medical markets, there's another example. So Village Farms now going to be putting their products into the Israeli market. Also, just kind of an example that Canadian companies are still very heavily focused on the international market, and that in general there still is a huge untapped international market when it comes to medical cannabis, when it comes to cannabis overall. Again, Germany has done fairly well, at least it's built itself out somewhat. Israel is doing a lot more. I'd say a lot more aggressively. Obviously, there's been a lot of other uncontrolled sort of external issues that have slowed down the industry, COVID policies, etc., and just how that country is doing at the moment. But, and then, obviously international incidents. But, again, when you're looking at how that market's getting established, its sales growth, its overall growth, its internal production capacity, a lot of these things have accelerated quite rapidly. When you're looking at government legislation and granting of licenses, they've moved fairly rapidly. So I do think you're still going to see Canadian companies and companies that are at least focused on the international market continue to look at Israel. For Village Farms, I think this is an obvious good setup. They'll be able to probably use some of their assets that they have as far as distribution into Israel to then also move some of their products into Germany later. And I do think in general you're still seeing that Canadian product is fairly well received in the Israeli market. It doesn't make up a huge percentage of the sales. It's not the total market. You're still starting to see internal production make its impact in the Israeli market. But for now, I still think it'll be well received for a while. I do think specifically with the Village Farms, just because it is some of their product and some of their brands that have done well in the Canadian market, as opposed to kind of the more garbagey products. Again, unfortunately, the medical market hasn't been getting premium products for a while. They've been getting a lot of sort of second-rate products as the industry continues to expand. But with this, at least, it'll be more high-grade products. And that's just because Israel, in general, tends to be a more consumer-conscious market and tends to kind of require higher premium products. So I think in general this will be a good move for Village Farms, and again continues to show that there is an international market that will exist. It's still a ways away, and I guess there's a lot of speculation that the US is going to be the biggest player in that international space with regards to potentially the pharma play of the US. That could be true in the future. As of right now, though, again, when you're looking at sort of how the U.S. would be involved in international market, it doesn't really seem to make sense for them. It's going to be very difficult for a lot of those companies to sort of get product in or out of their country and into other markets. Whereas, again, for some of these Canadian or Colombian-based companies, there is a lot more access points. And I do think that there's a lot of potential that's still being untapped when it comes to the medical market. There's an insane amount of potential that's being untapped when it comes to the textile and hemp industry. And really the applications of cannabis have still been fairly limited. So I do think that there can be a lot more that can be utilized out of this plant if people are allowed access to it. And you are starting to see that in these other markets where the medical cannabis is the main focus, the hesitancy is starting to dissipate, and you are starting to again see examples of insurance coming into play, of government legislation moving forward, because they're just focusing on the medical access point. They're not trying to turn this into everybody can smoke weed everywhere all the time, and we want pop-up stores everywhere. Unfortunately, as much as I love access to recreational, and I do think that people should be allowed to have access just fundamentally, when it comes to an international market, medical does need to be the focus always. It's the only thing that kind of legitimizes this entire industry. And it's why it's so frustrating, again, when you're saying that there's still people who say that there's a lack of data or a lack of research, because, again, there's a huge established international medical market where there's a ton of research and a ton of actual patient data that people can point to see if these products are effective over long term, over short term, etc. But I do think that it's good to see that companies are still focused on that international market, and that international idea is still in existence and pushing forward. So, moving on to other news, in a recent Bloomberg article titled "Cheap Weed Has Become a Big Problem in the Industry," the overall price of cannabis is implied to be a growing issue for both legal and legacy markets, as the two cannibalize one another over price. The article states that if you thought regulatory issues were the cannabis industry's biggest challenges going into 2023, take a closer look at the price of raw marijuana flower. Retail and wholesale prices have fallen as competition with the black market puts pressure on legal retailers to keep prices low, and this is making it hard for growers to get supply-demand balance right. The industry today is facing a number of headwinds. The most existential is pricing, said Rick Maturo, Director of Insights and Intelligence for Cannabis Data at BDSA, during a webinar last week. And the retail price of a gram of marijuana dropped 13% to $9.43. That's US in the third quarter of 2022, from $10.83 in the same period a year earlier, the steepest fall ever seen for marijuana in a 12-month period, according to BDSA. And wholesale price declines were even more dramatic, especially in more mature markets that have had legal programs for longer. In Colorado, the average price per pound has declined 51% since the fourth quarter of 2020. In Oregon, it's down 36%. Now, while there is heavy competition for lower price products in the legal market, and yes, this is heavily influenced by the existence of the legacy market, the underlying cause for concern is still primarily cost of operations and licensing. One also has to consider what implications could be of the eventual globalized market where products of South America be in play and production can get as low as 50 cents a gram. And I will say this also ignores the fact that in many established markets, high-priced concentrates and true premium bud have continued to actually grow their overall market share and are slowly taking more and more sales away from low-cost bulk products. And this also is an area where the legal market has legacy markets. And this is an area where the legacy market can't really compete due to the high-quality nature of the extraction and grow facilities where these products are made, which can't be replicated or properly established in the legacy market. So when you're looking at this is an ongoing discussion in the industry, again, when you're talking to growers directly, and when you're talking to some of these companies that are doing distribution for supplying the sort of product for large distribution companies, price is starting to become an issue where you're starting to see that the industry, as it continues to expand, especially in, again, more established markets, the price just continues to get lower and lower. And this is also... So there's a lot of things going on there. Again, there are issues that do come out of this. And a big issue is that a lot of the early sort of forecasting of how these businesses are going to operate when they get into these markets is based off of sort of really high pricing of licensing, really high price of operations. Again, to get established into a lot of these markets isn't cheap. Especially when you're getting into a new state that's just sort of legalizing some sort of medical program. You're going to be paying more for the license. There's going to be limited licenses. You're going to be paying more to ensure that your facilities have all of these sort of amazing qualities that might not actually need to be established over the long term. And that's really where the pricing problem starts to show up, is as the markets become more established, you start to see that the regulatory body starts to understand the industry better, and it doesn't go as hard on certain regulations, and then you start to see that there's more options for outdoor grows. There's more options for cheaper, small microgrow operations as well. And as those come into play, they can keep getting the cost lower and lower. So if you built a giant, brand new state-of-the-art facility, over time you could get beat out by a series of small grow facilities that all provide to one distribution network. And again, I've talked about sort of the craft beer model. And so it really depends on which element or sort of which side of the industry you sort of have been focusing on and how you've seen this play out over the long term. Also, again, once you start to see the markets build out, especially the sort of recreational market get built out, you start to see that for the actual retail side, there's not really a lot of options available when it comes to competing with another retail store other than pricing and quality. That's pretty much all you have available. You have your staffing and your training, but that becomes fairly homogenized in a very established market. So when you look at like a California, Colorado, once you have enough retail stores open, it really just becomes fairly generic as far as what you see for staffing quality and staffing understanding of the entire industry and of the products. Everyone gets actually pretty competent, or generic at least is what I would say. And as that starts to happen again, how can these retail stores compete? Well, a big part of it just unfortunately becomes pricing, and a big reason that that's the only area that they can compete in is because there's not a lot of other options when it comes to marketing, when it comes to brand opportunities, when it comes to promotion. So there's a lot of things going on here when it comes to why pricing is becoming a huge issue. The biggest thing when you're actually looking at it is, again, the cost of operations. And a lot of this does come from taxation and regulatory costs. And so as the industry continues to evolve, we do need to start addressing licensing costs, regulatory fines, as well as just the overall cost of operations and how you can continue to survive. And that's just something as well when you're looking at any of the companies who are going into these markets. Look at their business model, look at how they're structured, and see if they're focused on a long-term business model that's actually going to make sense once regulations do what they obviously will. As these markets continue to evolve and grow and become more prominent in those states, it's just inevitable that the regulations will have to sort of catch up with how the industry continues to evolve. And so look at established markets, look at established market prices, and also start looking at international prices, because as I've said, it's not going to impact the U.S. anytime soon because the federal regulations are going to keep any international market sort of out of there. But eventually, this is going to become something you need to start looking at as international players from South America, from Africa, from Israel, from other parts of the world start to bring product all over the world, at least in the medical sense. They can produce for insanely low rates. Again, 50 cents a gram is being achieved in some parts of South America, and they're aiming for lower. And if you're, the only way to sort of stay competitive is to either understand that that's a reality that you'll eventually have to come against, or to look at the fact that eventually there's the other side of the industry to focus on, which is the high price market. So to pay attention to concentrates, to pay attention to Cannabis 2.0 products, to pay attention to just premium bud, and to realize that those markets actually continue to gain sales percentages as these industries continue to get established. Is actually people start to look for these higher end products as the market gets more evolved and established, and consumer awareness goes up. You start to see people actually want to buy higher grade product. So you don't have to focus on cheap products. So even saying that, the price, you have to just produce for low cost, you don't really have to. You could actually just focus specifically on premium. And yes, the difficulty is going to be you have to produce really good weed. You have to produce really good concentrates. And they have to be, the only way to stay competitive there is strictly on quality. And then you can kind of ignore price to somewhat. Yes, you're not going to get the same percentage of sales as far as sort of bulk quantity, but there are ways to stay afloat. So definitely something to pay attention to, as well as in a recent CBC article, which discussed how cannabis culture has been impacted as one of the oldest stores selling smoking paraphernalia in Ottawa closed its doors for good, or will be closing its door for good in this spring. Mike Foster opened the head shop in Westboro in 1992, before moving its location to Glebe in 1997, and the iconic Cannabis counterculture store has been seen as an institution in the city. Now, Foster was involved in the effort to legalize cannabis because he said he didn't want to see people getting arrested for using the drug, but its legalization also led to the growth of larger retail operations catering to cannabis aficionados. The proliferation of cannabis shops certainly affected our sales of smoking accessories, he said. Once legalization happened, our sales plummeted, and there's so many stores out there now, like every few blocks, there's a cannabis shop, and you can buy your papers or pipes there, so that aspect of our business has suffered. Despite the challenges, Foster doesn't have any regrets about supporting legalization efforts, as he was still happy to see progress being made in that regard. Now, David Silberman, a professor of marketing at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, said stores like Crosstown Traffic have lost that forbidden fruit appeal that they had when Cannabis was prohibited. Head shops had a rebellious nature that drew people in, Silberman said, working in the margins between legal and illegal. Legalization kind of takes a bit of romance out of the whole cannabis counterculture rebellion, Foster agreed. Now, what this article does not take into account, however, is that competition also exposes flaws. So, obviously, I think this isn't news to anyone in that they've seen a lot of sort of the legacy businesses, head shops, obviously any of the legacy growers and everything. It's difficult for them to get established into the legal market. And the culture around cannabis has shifted dramatically. Again, when you go to a cannabis conference, if you've been going to them for years, you've seen how the entire sort of atmosphere is slowly changing and slowly shifting over time as more people come into this industry. Other people sort of leave. You've seen a lot of people now focus more on psychedelics, who are the part of the original grassroots movements, as they now see that that is where you need to put the energy as far as legalization efforts. You've also seen people disappointed again with how the medical industry has sort of fallen by the wayside as this industry turns more recreational. And then again, with regards to head shops and sort of glass culture and all of that, you've seen it shift dramatically into more of a production model. And this is just due to supply and demand, as well as, again, sort of the general clientele and customers who are now coming into this industry. But there is some other factors to sort of consider there. One of the aspects many legacy consumers have come to realize now is that there are more options available when it comes to aspects like inventory management, quality control, proper staffing, proper staff training, overall business functionality. Many legacy stores and growers were under-delivering due to the lack of competition. So the reality is that a lot of the things that used to exist, sort of pre-legalization, whether you're looking at Canada or the US, what you can realize is that a lot of these companies were seen as sort of these amazing establishments that had been there for so long because they were the only establishments. And as actual companies start coming into the space and as more competition comes in there, it does start to expose how these businesses were run just as far as general business sense or general management, in that a lot of them didn't really do a lot of these basic fundamentals very well because they didn't need to, because they didn't have huge consumer demand, because they weren't always pushed, because also the consumers who were coming there weren't expecting these sort of different quality control aspects. But as you're seeing now a broader consumer demographic come into these markets, consumer preferences and sort of consumer demands grow, and these businesses need to grow with them. And this is a big sort of difficulty of the entire cannabis culture and the cannabis industry as it gets more established, is how does it maintain some of its original grassroots culture while also becoming functional enough to serve a larger consumer base? Because that's the difficulties. You can't have sort of that chill, yeah, man vibe and actually get a bunch of shit done at scale. And that's kind of always been the balancing act that a lot of people get angry about, and a lot of sort of the infighting within the cannabis industry comes from, is, there's sort of that chill, original counterculture that is very much part of what makes cannabis culture interesting and sort of what pushed this industry into legalization in the first place. But at the same time, there is also the other aspects of functionality that if you want this to be, taken seriously by people who are hesitant about it, there needs to be more education. There needs to be real management of inventory. There needs to be a real simple system of retail, as opposed to sort of systems that sort of barely functioned in the past. So in order for cannabis to be able to compete with prescription medical medications as medicine, which is sort of the main reason to focus on cannabis, is that this is a medicine for a lot of people, and that this has a huge opportunity to get a huge amount of people in the world, not just in Canada and the US, but everywhere, to be able to get off of just an insane amount of pharmaceutical drugs that are killing them. This is insane amount of potential when you're looking at replacing alcohol as a social lubricant, which is one of the leading causes of domestic violence, emergency room calls, driving accidents, and really just negative culture. When you look at some of the most negative cultural aspects of society today, a lot of them come from alcohol, and it comes from the fact that alcohol is sort of our alpha drug in culture today. And if we could switch that to cannabis, a huge amount of things would change for the better. Cannabis for everyone is in every way a positive move for the world. If you find yourself disheartened by the taboo factor that this plant is being removed, then you do have to ask yourself that what was the culture you were really endorsing to begin with? And that's sort of the question that is the industry as a whole, and again, the infighting aspect of the industry is slowly addressing, which is, what are you really focusing on when you're looking at cannabis counterculture? Well, if you want cannabis to be a plant that actually does impact the world and, is taken by your parents, is taken treated normally, is just treated as a plant. If you want to get to that point where people can just grow cannabis in the yard and nobody gives a shit about it and everyone just treats that as normal because it's a plant, and kids could run up and eat it, nothing's going to happen to them. Like that's a real thing, that there's no active THC. If people just start eating the buds, it's gross. It's like kids eating any plants. There's tons of flowers that just exist in nature all the time that are hyper poisonous. We don't ban all the flowers from growing in nature. That makes no sense. And it's the same thing with cannabis. We could just treat it like it's a plant. It's a plant that has poisonous aspects to it, as far as almost every plant. Cannabis for a lot of people makes people just break out in hives if they touch it while it's still active and growing. It produces a bunch of terpenes. Those terpenes can totally cause allergic reactions for a lot of people. So if we start treating it as just an actual plant that has psychoactive components to it, but not a regulated substance, that's how cannabis will actually impact the world the most positively, is getting to that point where there's none of this stigma attached to it, and there's none of this, oh man, you smoke weed, you must be this type of person. We don't really assume anything about a person if they drink or if they don't drink. It's pretty rare to find people, at least from certain age groups, that don't drink at all and have never consumed alcohol. And, that doesn't really say much about you, though. If you say, going for a drink with someone is a fairly casual and normal social thing to exist in North American and global culture, and having a joint with someone eventually needs to get to that same place, or having a cannabis beverage, if that's the only form that we can understand globally, is consuming beverages, then cannabis beverages would at least be the better option. But in order to get to that point, the counterculture aspect almost has to disappear. That's almost an inevitability. So you can't be part of mainstream culture and also be counterculture. That's sort of the catch-22 of it. Of if you get globally accepted, and again, grandma's smoking weed and nobody bats an eye at it, and kids can be around people smoking weed and nobody's weirded out by it and thinking that all these kids are going to die and they're going to become drug addicts, and all the crazy things that still get circulated today, that people are still saying there's not enough evidence, that we don't know about this. It's a very annoying but very real thing, is that if we want cannabis and eventually psychedelics to actually be normalized and be part of normal society, then we do have to accept that a lot of the things that focus on the counterculture aspect and focus on sort of that, we're going against the system, man, vibe, are obviously going to not succeed very well within a globally accepted industry, because it just doesn't make sense. Again, having a speakeasy in the time of bars where, you can maybe name your bar a speakeasy and have that as sort of the theme, but to actually be this sort of weird illegal setup where you're unlicensed, why would people come there? Because they're not going to trust that your mixologists know what they're doing. They're not going to trust that you keep things clean. They're going to be able to shut you down easily. It just doesn't make sense. And, there's a lot of people who say, like, we shouldn't have had legalized it and all these things. Well, that's the first step in a long line of steps that needs to happen, which is, first it gets legalized, then slowly legalization changes, and then more and more markets evolve. And then eventually we realize, yes, this is an international CPG product. Like anything else, it should be able to be imported and exported, obviously, like all products. They still need to be looked at to make sure that there's not a huge amount of pests on them, all sorts of other considerations, that they're the right quality, that it is what it says it is, all of those normal things that we do with all other import-export products. But it shouldn't be treated any differently than any other plants. And in order for it to get to that amount of normalcy, almost all of the counterculture has to eventually disappear. So it's a weird, sad realization when you look at how this industry will continue to evolve as it becomes this global industry eventually. And I think a lot of people who are in this industry and who are into the idea of cannabis actually impacting the world in a positive way and psychedelics impacting the world in a positive way have to be aware that in order for it to get there, a lot of the cool factor of these drugs needs to disappear, almost all of it. It does need to become something that nobody gives a shit about. And again, it shouldn't be something that people freak out about now. In some parts of the world, people don't really care at all, but there's still a huge amount of stigma surrounding those substances. And the eventual goal is to get it to be there's zero stigma. That, again, grandma has a drink, nobody says anything. People drink in front of their kids, nobody says anything. That's what we eventually want cannabis to replace, is that same scenario, and for people to not even really think about it, that it's just become this thing that is now normalized and understood and isn't seen as some sort of dangerous lunatic substance, but is instead just a normal product. That's all for today's podcast. Enjoy the rest of your week. That's all for today's podcast. Podcast is now a certified word trademark on the blockchain through Cognate Incorporated CM certification. InvestorIdeas.com podcasts are also available on iTunes, Spotify, Google Play Music, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Spreaker, and TuneIn. If you'd like to be a guest or sponsor of this podcast, please contact InvestorIdeas.com. Investor Ideas reminds all listeners to read our disclaimers and disclosures on the InvestorIdeas.com website, and this podcast is not an endorsement to buy products or services or securities. Investors are reminded that all investments involve risk and possible loss of investment. Investor Ideas does not condone the use of cannabis except where permissible by law. Our site does not possess, distribute, or sell cannabis products.